Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. Welcome to this side event of the 21st ECOSOC Financing for Development Forum. It is jointly convened by the African Tax Administration Forum and the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Metals, Minerals, and Sustainable Development. The topic for our discussion today is maximizing mining revenues for sustainable development in the 21st century. My name is Viola Tarus, and I'm a policy advisor with IGF. The low carbon transition means two things. Number one, we are diversifying away from fossil fuels. And number two, there's going to be increased demand for minerals and metals that will power the green technology. What does it mean? This is an opportunity for mining revenues to increase, and from the demand of these minerals and metals, which in turn can strengthen countries' domestic revenue mobilization, including an opportunity to finance the sustainable development goals. This session forms part of a joint ATAF and IGF initiative called the Future of Resource Taxation, which calls on government, non-government stakeholders, and industry to come together to evaluate the current mining taxation and reforms needed to maximize revenues from the mining sector. I'm excited to share with you our esteemed panel who will contribute to this discussion. We have Mr. Logon Wort, who's the Executive Secretary of ATAF. We have Alexander Redhead, who's the lead for tax and extractive industries with IGF. We also have government officials present with us. That's Mr. Abdoulaye Magassouba, who's the Minister of Mines and Geology from Guinea. We also have Tax Commissioner Zayabal Batjargal from Mongolia. And we also have Ms. Ana Carolina Gonzalez, who's a Senior Program Officer with Ford Foundation. Our panelists will share their reflection, their thoughts on the future of mining sector and its implication of the mineral revenues. They will speak to some of the challenges to mining revenue collection and also some of the efforts that have gone to combat these challenges. They will also speak to some of the policy reforms and the need for them to be able to maximize on revenue collection. The rest of the session will be structured as follows. We are going to hear from three speakers first, Mr. Logon, followed by Mr. Magassouba, then Commissioner Zayabal, before we open up to the first round of Q&A. We are going to be followed by Ms. Ali and Ms. Ana Carolina before we finalize on our second round of Q&A. I will speak briefly on the future of resource taxation thereafter, and we will end the session. I now invite Mr. Logon Wort to make his remarks. Mr. Logon, over to you. You have 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the side event on maximizing revenues. It's a very proud partnership we have with the Intergovernmental Forum, with whom we've been working on the continent for a while now, and I will in a minute reflect some of the work that we are doing. We are very pleased with this meeting today and also very grateful for all of you for attending and joining in the conversation. ATAF is the premier tax organization on the continent. We are going into our 11th year of existence. For those who need to understand, ATAF is a similar organization to, for example, IOTA in Europe or SEAT in Latin America. There isn't really an equivalent in Asia, although there are some organizations. And over the past 10 years, just going into 11, ATAF has been involved in tax administration and policy reform in Africa, and you'll be able to see a lot of the impact of our work in the reports and on our website. We have found that broadly multinational or let me say corporate income tax forms a very, very big part of the broader revenue collection on the continent. And being a resource rich part of the world, clearly multinational activity in the resource sector has a great impact in its revenue movement. And so for us over the years, working on the continent, many African tax administrations have reported that losing millions of dollars in corporate income tax, mainly due to illicit financial flows as a result of aggressive tax avoidance and profit shifting in the broader M&E sector, and more specifically in the mining sector. And so how do we respond to these? We do this by working, for example, in partnership with the IGF, and part of that program is providing in-depth and long-term technical assistance to address these flows. Some of our key work have been done in this partnership in countries such as Senegal and Zambia. And a key part of that work is the toolkits and designing and guides that we design in legislative reform and actual debt management and audit operations within these countries. And so the work that we do in the mining sector in countries on the continent include reviewing existing legislation, advising on legislative changes, and actual hand-on assistance in administration in audits, especially relating to transfer pricing and other profit-shifting risks. And illicit financial flows risk are an important part of this. So our work has found that the risk areas of illicit financial flows are mainly the minerals that are being sold at undervalue to related companies. And these companies are located in low or no tax jurisdictions. And of course, also excessive payments in the form of royalties and interest to related companies. Now, these are artificial transactions that to a large extent devalues the actual revenue that countries should be collecting. And you can take any industry, but if you take diamonds, for example, with I think more than 135,000 pricing points, key markets around the world, no value being added, these mineral changes hands 3 or 4 times, escalating in price. But where these minerals were mined, none of those additional value accrues to the country where these minerals were mined. And that is typical of what we are seeing in terms of the illicit financial flow experience that we've had. And one can see the extent of these losses in profit shifting just by, for example, looking at one landmark Supreme Court decision in Zambia, where in the case of Zambia Revenue Authority and the Mopani copper mining industry, the decision resulted in a major victory for the Revenue Authority, and the mining company had to pay an additional $13 million just by fixing some of the legislation and enforcing. The other area that's important in this whole discussion to mitigate the risk from excessive payments is the fact that African countries impose withholding taxes on payments, and they do this often to at least obtain some form of payment. However, even this weapon of a withholding tax becomes under pressure because of another element in the broader tax chain, and that is tax treaties. In most cases, African tax treaties either reduces or totally cancel out withholding taxes. And as a result, not even that you are able to collect. So you lose a significant amount of money due to weak tax treaties that also results in these flows in the sector. And we've seen in one case, for example, for the period 2013 to 2018, one African country losing more than $73 million in tax revenue due to the deduction in the withholding tax rate in just one treaty being null and void as a result of the provisions of that treaty. So those are important losses that we have to look at. I think the other area to look at that's very important is losses as a result of tax incentives. Now, obviously, there's often 10-year tax holidays. These incentives are poorly drafted. And one challenge that's going to come up in these incentives is something that is happening on the other side of the tax world. The taxation of the digital economy and the discussions going on in Paris has got some emerging provision that is going to affect these incentives. And the key one is something called the minimum tax rate. So in re-looking at the taxation of the global economy, there's an emerging possibility of a minimum tax rate on all multinational transactions. And if your country gives a free tax holiday to any business, you are simply giving over the minimum tax. Let's say it's 12 or 20%, whatever it's going to be. You're actually passing on that tax that you could have collected. Because you're giving a tax holiday, you're passing it on to the resident country of that government. And you're basically saying to someone, I don't need the $73 million, you can have it. And that's what is going to happen with incentives if we are not particularly careful how we're going to do this. So that is really an important element. And maybe also to say there are broadly other issues here. Contracts are poorly negotiated. Treaties need to be re-looked at, especially in the provisions of the payment of technical services, thin capitalization, and also, of course, withholding taxes, amongst others. But then issues around audit and investigation and the skills, not accounting skills, not legal skills, geology, other type of skills you need in order to understand mining. I will conclude. I mean, we've had, and I may have said this somewhere else before, but Tanzania was an example, and the president there just died. But one of the things he did when he came in, he did a lot of things that had the mining sector shaken up. It was unusual what he did. He sort of canceled contracts of Australian mining companies and others, and there was an outrage around the world. But what was he experiencing? Not condoning what he did, because you don't really go about doing it like that, but what was he experiencing? In the case of one mining company, they were not taking out copper. They were taking out the earth and loading the earth onto the boat and extracting the copper somewhere else. But in that earth, there was uranium, platinum, all sorts of other minerals that they were now stealing because they were exporting copper. And that is the extent of, if you do not look, if you do not have the legislation, if you do not have the skills, and so on. And so what do we do? In ATAF, and some of this we do in conjunction with the IGF, we have programs. We have programs that renegotiates treaties. We've got an African Standard Treaty that is what we call an improvement of both the UN and the OECD model. We've got a transfer pricing reform program. We've got an audit and investigation program. Over the last 5 years, $1 billion in additional tax was assessed in less than 10 African countries through this program. So what are we saying? What is to be done? As Africans, and I'm talking from an African perspective, and I'm hoping the ministers would agree with me. As Africans, when we answer the question, what is to be done, we must firstly say, we must stop complaining. We must stop complaining, we must act. We must stop having a victim mentality, we must take control. How do we do that? We must do reform. We must audit, we must investigate, and we must not be scared of politically connected owners in the mining industry that we are afraid to touch and investigate and make changes to the laws, because that is how we lose revenue. So in conclusion, it is important to look at a total reform, not only in the mining sector, but in the broad sector of corporate taxation. It is important to link this with a broader reform that is currently underway in the taxation of the digital economy, because the implications of that is for the whole global economy, and importantly for developing countries. What is being discussed is risking our taxing rights. And if we don't participate in these discussions, and if we don't get our share of revenue, we're going to end up collecting less, because in Paris at the moment, they are busy reallocating global taxing rights. And if our voice is not going to be heard, we are going to lose out big time. So I'm happy to join you today. The message is we must act. We must act domestically in order to strengthen our participation internationally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Logan. Thank you for highlighting the challenges that are faced in the mining sector, including transfer pricing and tax treaties. But also, I want to commend ATAF and the work they are doing to support government officials. And you're right, it's time to stop complaining and act. I'd like now to invite our second speaker, Mr. Magassouba. Welcome to the floor.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Let me talk to you about the Republic of Guinea. We have lots of natural resources. We have huge potential, extraordinary potential, not only from the quantity point of view, but also the quality. We have diverse resources. For the longest time, the Republic of Guinea was known for this, but since 2010, we have been committed to reform the sector so that the country is now known for not just its potential, but the fact that we're tapping into that potential. We changed the mining code. We were able to review different mining conventions, and this between 2012 and 2016. We had a complete reform, and we have an agenda for transparency across the sector. These reforms were necessary. Why? Because it's true that we're losing a lot of revenue coming from the mining sector. Do we think that the revenues that are being perceived are or correspond to the real production? If we think about bauxite, for example, we know that there is a high level of production of bauxite. And are we actually able to collect this revenue? I'm not sure. I think it's very important to have a very practical approach. We are in a very high position. We can carry out different arbitration between the production and what we're able to collect as taxed. And we also have different reforms or different action plans on mid and long term. There isn't any revenue without activity. If we're talking about tax revenue for a state, the only reason that this exists is because there is mining activity. Something is happening, and we're able to generate this revenue. That is our starting point. When we see the different steps that have been adopted and taken in Guinea, I would say that the Guinean approach starts from this basis, the fact that we know that there's production, and so we should be able to perceive these revenues. For example, if we look at bauxite has been, we're one of the highest potential countries across the world, and this was in 2010. In 2020, we exported more than 80 million tons of bauxite. So there has been an increase of production between 2010 and 2020. This has catapulted us into a certain dynamic, which means that we have created potential to collect revenue, which is not currently what we're doing. So to start off with, in order to be able to increase our revenue, our mining revenue, we need to ensure that there's an increase of production. So once you've created that activity, that production, this is an element that I would like to home in on. You need to attract investors. We can always talk about efficiency of different factors and how to make your market more attractive. We've already mentioned financial and fiscal incentives. If we look at two-thirds of investment go to infrastructure. And in other countries that are a lot more advanced from a development perspective, for these same projects, investors are investing two-thirds into the project and rather than the infrastructure. So how can we ensure as the Republic of Guinea that we're attracting the right investors? There is a difference for availability. We don't have the infrastructure available that some of our neighboring countries do. There are other countries where transport costs of bauxite are 50% those of our bauxite. For example, to go from Australia to China, the transport of bauxite from Australia to China is half that of transport costs from Guinea to China. It's not just about looking at the avant-gardist literature that's out there. We need to ensure that the framework, that the basic framework is in place from an investment point of view. That said, the figures are there and we need to do something with them. Financial incentives, fiscal incentives, they're objective. And when these different incentives are reasonable, I think that they are necessary. They're necessary so that we're able to develop as a country. If we think about the stage that Guinea is currently in, financial incentives were a necessity for us. You need to create activity. The second thing is apply. You need to apply the text. The texts exist. Between the conventions, the mining code, the mining code that is currently in place, I should add. If all of these different guidelines and principles were implemented, I think that there would be more revenue for the Guinean state, which is why I think that one of the focus points for us should be, and one of the focus points is in Guinea, is capacity building. Capacity building for tax authorities, for audits. We're moving away from a paper-based system. We're trying to use technologies, IT, communication tools. We're also, in a certain, or to a certain extent, tightening up our fiscal controls, our fiscal audits, in order to identify where there is room for improvement. And all of the different loopholes that are exploited, not only just in the mining sector, but in other sectors in the Republic of Guinea, so that we're able to stamp down on tax evasion. Once we'll have been able to improve the implementation of these different texts and guiding principles, I think that the next logical step would be to increase, in my opinion, different mining revenues and the way that we're able to collect mining revenues. We're working very hard to guarantee that we have long-term development, not just through our budgets and how we're investing in infrastructure, but also in the way in which we use mining revenues as an entry point into other sectors. How can we bridge those gaps between the mining sector and the other sectors in order to increase our tax base, which in turn, would allow us to strengthen the sustainable development of our country? And that's what I would like to say as a first point. And obviously I'm at your disposal if you have any questions or if you want any clarifications. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Magassouba, for your intervention. It is clear that there are several building blocks to increase production. One of them you mentioned is reforms within the sector, and this has been done within Guinea, including the mining codes and transparency. Another building block is enabling infrastructure. You also mentioned capacity building to tax administrators. This will increase the production, but then it should also increase the mining revenues, which can be able to finance sustainable development goals. Thank you very much. I'd like to encourage audience to pose your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We're going to listen to the Tax Commissioner, Zayabal, for a few minutes, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. So welcome very much, Minister Zayabal, Tax Commissioner Zayabal.
Thank you, Viola. Dear esteemed members and participants of this event, thank you very much for inviting me to participate as a speaker. As you all might know, that Mongolia is one of the world's rich countries in terms of natural resources. Our natural resources is attracted for the investors. For instance, there are more than 2,300 mines, over 90 different types of minerals have been registered in the Mineral Reserve Fund of Mongolia. With the adoption of the Mineral Law of Mongolia in 2007, a stable legal environment was created in mineral sector, and a new tax relationship with the investors began to be a major challenge for our office. Today, 46% of the total tax revenue to the state budget was collected from the mining license holders and businesses operated in the mining industry in Mongolia. Current legal environment, tax revenues from the mineral sector are collected from annual license payment, direct taxes on sales, and transfer of the license ownership and ownership shares and securities, and royalty and indirect taxes such as CIT and VIT. As a heavily mining sector dependent economy, our priority is to shift current non-renewable resources-based, unstable and prone to world market change revenue to a revenue suited for fueled sustainable development, built on fiscal and taxation policies, modeled on the international best practices and experimented by countries with the similar conditions. In a situation where only a handful of the economic policy decisions around natural resources, administration achieves success and avoid resource curse, the most effective administrative tools is a robust and comprehensive tax policy. Direct and indirect revenues from the mineral sector became Mongolian the main revenue source in last 10 years. This in turn creates diverse challenges. In addition, changes in the mineral law of 2007 and 2009 and the third commodity super cycle of the 2008 to 2011 led to 4 to 11 times increase in the foreign direct investment in Mongolian mineral sector. This increased engagement with the foreign entities created a number of tax challenges, including transfer pricing and base erosion of the tax issues in Mongolia. In case of Mongolia, the new tax law package was adopted by the parliament in 2019 and came into force in January 1st in 2020, marking the beginning of the second reform of the tax system and revision and implementation of the price transfer and international tax regulations. To overcome the challenges we face, Mongolian Tax Administration partnered with IGF and launched a deep dive program in Mongolia and started collaborating with the international experts for 2 years. Within the framework of the program, the experts assisted to improve in methodology of the assessing taxes on minerals. The taxes collected to the state budget and certification issued in accordance with the methodology become generally accepted procedures by the companies operating in mining sector. We also work successfully with IGF in training tax officials on the interaction between domestic law, international treaties, and the mining investment agreements based on the transfer pricing audit experiences. Mongolian Tax Administration, with assistance, also the assistance of the Tax Inspector Without Border program, together with the IGF's deep dive program, we have effectively conducted the transfer pricing audits on the multinational entities operating in the mining sector in the last year. Currently, also, we are working with the international experts to provide the tax officials with the robust training on the access and sales agreements of coal and copper exporting companies for transfer pricing purposes. Mongolian Tax Administration has started digitalizing the mining tax matters as part of the administration's digitalization within the broader framework of the digital governance initiatives adopted by the government of Mongolia. Demand for the mineral and precious metals is on the rise as we transit to the digitalization in the mining sector and to low carbon society to promotes green growth. This opens a great opportunity for our country to raise sustainable funding for its sustainable development goals through the tax revenue from the mining sector, especially from the sales of the raw materials such as copper, zinc, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements, which are essential for the fourth industrial revolution. However, to take the full advantage of this opportunity, it is necessary to develop Mongolian tax administration as administration that is capable to fulfillment its commitments to enrolling in sustainable development goal of the country with the vast mineral resources by improving the capacity of its staff and to keep pace with the global development. We aim to provide the government with sustainable tax revenue necessary to sustainable development goals to achieve a transition from the raw material exporter to finished good exporter and distribute the benefits of the next commodity super cycle to develop the rest of the economy. To this end, it is essential for our tax administration to receive international experts' assistance and international organizations' support when adopting the largest technological trends and blockchains and big data analysis that are already introduced by other tax administrations and capitalize the benefits of digitalization in preparing the tax policy, strengthening the tax collection capacity of the tax administration. At last, I would like to thank again the IGF, African Tax Administration Forum, and International Institute for the Sustainable Development for organizing this special event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Zayabal. Thank you for your remarks. And it's true, summarizing what the tax commissioner mentioned, it's one thing to have abundance of minerals, but for it to translate into foreign direct investments or revenues to finance sustainable development, there has to be sound policy framework and administrative framework to enable for these resources to translate into revenues. And also would like to thank also the initiatives by IGF and the tax inspectors without borders in supporting such countries to ensure that they are able to maximize on these revenues. I'd like now to open up for Q&A session for 10 minutes. Kindly type in your questions and we are able to share with our speakers. There's a question for you, Minister Magassouba, on the chat in French. Maybe I can just translate it into English for the audience. They're asking whether the infrastructure that you talked about it being developed in Guinea, was it developed by government or the mining companies? And maybe just before you respond, we have seen in the future of the mining sector that technology is going to be an important element. On one hand, we are going to see technology will increase the viability of minerals, but at the same time, it's going to replace low-skilled labor in some of the countries where mining has employed a large number of communities. Do you want to speak? You might want to also touch on this in relation to Guinea. Mr. Magassouba.
Oui, madame, merci beaucoup. Je vais je vois la question.
Yes, thank you very much. Because there are few questions in French, so I see the question of Ms. Sacco on tax incentives. So what I can say is that for a few reasons. It's not only linked to tax incentives. Globally, we attracted more investments in Guinea over the last 10 years that we had in the past 52 years. So we have had more investments now in the past 10 years than Guinea had never have in the past in its history. We have also more jobs that were created 10 years ago. So we had a great improvement. But now, to know whether the government, the state, or the companies are the winners, I don't know what we do, and Mr. Wort talked about it, is that we improved the quality of the discussion that we have with the mining companies. We have law firms working with us. We have financial firms as well that helped us, as well as technical firms through the negotiations, and we do this based on financial models. And we always ensure that there is a fair share of the revenues throughout the projects. So that's what we do at the beginning, at the start of our project. And we really try to ensure for all the administrations involved that the tax clauses are applied as they should be, in order to avoid tax transfer. I hope that I have answered your question. I see there are other questions. Another question about incentives. So it's almost the same answer, you know, but it's a debate. Should we give or should we not? Should we don't? I don't know. There are different points of view, but we know that there are a lot of measures and reforms that we could put into place in order to attract investments. We can't deny that. And on some websites, there was a report. I think it was covering 7,000 companies in different countries, and we saw that tax incentives on 12 points were number 11. So we can say that sometimes incentives are not quite useful to attract investors. But for Guinea, for example, if we have 12 criteria and incentives are number 11, and other countries are better than us in the first 10 points, then it might be important to improve that. So it really depends on the position and the strength and the competitiveness compared to other countries, because we need to take that into account as well. And for the question related to tax administrations, I'm not really an expert on that, but what I can say is that now we're on this process, and this process of digitalization. We do a lot of things online for the export, for example, and with that we have a lot of hope that technology will help us to reduce the some problems such as profit shifting, for example.
Thank you very much.
So that's what I was saying, and the tax avoidance as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Magassouba. Mr. Logan, there is a general question on the chat box that I'd like to hear your reflections on, brief reflections on. There's one on should resource-rich countries continue to focus on mining or develop other sectors of their economy? Briefly, would you like to give your intervention on that, Mr. Logan?
Thank you. It is obvious that the future of revenue on the continent is going to lie in the diversification of income and broadening the tax mix. We've seen that in Nigeria, where over a long period of time, about only 3% of non-oil income in that country was collected from other sources other than oil. When the oil price plummeted, they had a serious income problem. We have seen in the last 3 to 4, 5 years, they've moved that 3% to about 7, 8% now. They're targeting closer to the African average of between 18 and 20%. But it's important to diversify where you collect from and to broaden your tax mix. There are a number of tax areas that African countries do not venture into. Part of that, for example, is property taxes. One of the things we over-rely on are indirect taxes such as VAT, and this disproportionately taxes poor people. But where the money lies in multinational taxation, in high net worth individuals, in property taxation, in other taxes that progressively taxes wealth, we do not do that, often because these monies lies in the hands of politically connected people. So yes, it's important. We cannot rely on resource taxation only. If I may, I'd like to put my cents worth on incentives that was posted in the chat box. The minister also indicated that. It's important to note that Tax Justice Network in their research put the total loss of incentives in Africa to about 3.5% of total GDP. And as the minister says, on the list of priorities for an investment decision, incentive serves either number 11 or number 13. It's not the top. They look at human capital, education, road, infrastructure, energy. It is a very outdated idea, and sadly the politicians have this notion that they must give incentives. The only thing incentives may be required for in the sector is in exploration, because exploration requires a shared risk. Of course, there's a problem in exploration because sometimes the company struck in year 2 and they don't tell anyone. They only tell people in year 8 and they would have stolen 6 years worth of production. But those are technical issues that countries will have to do in the way that they manage this. And so the other point about can incentives ever, I think Hilda Ansa asks the question about exemptions, can it ever be removed? We think it can in terms of post-exploration, because you don't need to incentivize somebody to find a mineral that is there. With regards to the ownership and the way the deals are structured, as the minister explained about lawyers and accountants and so on and so on. At the base of all of this, governments must understand and agree who owns what is being taken out of the earth. If you understand who the fundamental owner is, it's a public good. It does not belong to the company, and so they don't need the incentive to go and get it out. It then influences the way you structure your contract. And those are very, very fundamental issues about how we must approach this. Finally, on the incentive, the one element that is totally within African and developing country control is the extent of corruption in the sector. Because when it comes to the contracts, the nature of what is being extracted and the profit share, often these contracts are signed for the cost of sending a minister or an influential person children to a school in America at the cost of a nation's possible revenue. Corruption is something that's in our control, and that often is the biggest problem, and incentives is a part of that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Logan. I'd like to ask Tax Commissioner Zayabal, there's one question on the chat box from Mr. Ron Smith on the dominant fiscal regime, which is mostly in the mining sector. of tax and royalty regime, and whether whether it's actually being used by governments or structured in a way to ensure that they maximize on the revenues, or now that Mongolia has abundance of minerals that are also going to be used in the energy transition, do you think there is a need to change this fiscal regime? Mr. Tax Commissioner Zayabal, if you can speak briefly on this comment.
For Mongolia, we have significant, huge mineral resources, and we want to. We are willing to keep up with the technology advancements that's happening around the world. We have mineral resources, and we need to keep up with the technology advancements. In terms of attracting foreign investment, we implement several tax policies, fiscal policies. So that includes stabilization agreements and investment agreements. And in order to, within the scope of the policy to attract foreign investment. And we have, as you may know, we have currently implementing one of the biggest copper projects in the world. So our priority is to attract investment, and so that would allow the mobilization and development of deposits in order to ensure fiscal revenue and stabilize government revenue. To secure revenue is our first priority.
Thank you, Tax Commissioner. We struggle for a minute there to hear from you. Thank you very much for your remarks. We'll move now to the last two sets of our speakers. To start us off with Ms. Ali from IGF. You can make your remarks.
Thanks very much, Viola, and thank you to our esteemed panelists for joining us for this session today. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and to our participants for joining us. So I'd like to shift the focus a little bit to the future. I think we've talked about some of the challenges that resource-rich countries face in maximizing revenues from the mining sector. So looking forward, considering the energy transition in particular and the role that minerals and metals will play in that process, what are the ways in which governments can rethink how best to maximize the financial benefits from their mineral wealth? So this is a second chance for many resource-rich countries to try and make the most out of their mining sector. In the past, we've had overly generous tax incentives, poorly constructed contracts, inadequate fiscal policies, but we have an opportunity here to break with that past and to make sure that mining counts in terms of financing the sustainable development agenda. So how can governments make the most of this opportunity? In our view, governments should move away from negotiating bespoke mining investment agreements that are vulnerable to corruption, to instead rely on the primary law to set out fiscal terms. Those that choose to continue to negotiate such contracts should disclose those publicly, as Minister Magassouba indicated that Guinea has done. They should also end the use of tax incentives once and for all, the effectiveness of which has been widely disputed, not least in relation to the mining sector. They should limit and narrow the use of fiscal stabilization provisions and ensure clear legal obligations on companies to pay their full share of taxes. Looking to the global level, Logan alluded to some of the changes taking place in the international tax landscape led by the OECD. At the global level, we need to make sure that the interests of resource-rich countries are reflected there, that the right of resource-rich countries to tax their mineral resources is not impacted or harmed by those reforms. But we should also look at the opportunities that the global stage present for improving mining taxation. Simplified approaches to international taxation of the mining sector that reduce the risk of tax avoidance and reinforce the right of resource-rich countries to tax their mineral resources. Some countries are already pioneering such measures. Logan mentioned our work in Zambia. Zambia and many other countries, particularly in Latin America, are using publicly quoted mineral prices to calculate corporate income tax, reducing the risk that companies deliberately understate the price of the mineral to pay less tax. Other countries use a government posted price. These approaches or other simplified measures could be considered at the global level. However, to truly break with the past and ensure that mining's new era delivers a greener economy and a more just, inclusive society, we must also pursue more fundamental reforms. Policymakers need a wider range of options that can be tailored for specific scenarios. In particular, they need options that are more likely to deliver reliable revenues. The basic mineral sector taxation tools have remained more or less the same over the past several decades: corporate income tax and royalties. Whereas royalties are predictable and easy to collect, corporate income tax is difficult to collect, often delayed, and vulnerable to profit shifting. Yet it is corporate income tax that is expected to deliver the lion's share of government revenues. The emphasis on profit-based taxes needs to change if governments are going to collect the revenue that they're owed. Some governments are already turning to other measures to deliver revenue, such as equity participation and production sharing contracts like those typically found in the oil sector. The number of African countries requiring state equity has increased considerably in recent years, not only in Africa, but in Mongolia as well. The government has a strong stake in a number of mining projects. Production sharing and risk service contracts are also promising, replacing taxes and royalties with a physical share of production that is easier to monitor and collect. Countries such as Papua New Guinea, Uganda, Senegal, and Gabon are all planning to or have already adopted production sharing regimes for mining. And of course, others may look to more flexible tools such as progressive royalties, increased government take of profitability, or effective rent taxes. These are some of the options or the more fundamental forms that we think should be on the table as part of the discussion on the future of resource taxation. It's important that governments of resource countries make the most of the demand for renewable energy minerals, so the minerals and metals that are required to power renewable energy. There's an opportunity to maximize mining revenues as a result, and of course, ensure that they contribute to sustainable development. Thank you, Viola. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ali. There is need for fiscal reforms, and as you have just noted, that corporate income taxes will not really deliver or maximize revenue from the sector. And you also mentioned a couple of countries that have already started on reforms, maybe also including production sharing contracts within their regimes. And I think it's important to have all governments to look at how they can change or how they can have reforms within their sectors enabled to maximize on their revenues. Thank you very much. I'd like now to welcome Ms. Anna Carolina. Thank you very much and welcome. Make your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Viola, and thank you all. Thank you especially to IGF and ATAF for the invitation. I am very honored to share this panel with you all. And I am also glad that I have the opportunity to share maybe a different perspective as I don't consider myself a tax expert. I think that other ideas about how communities or how civil society has been looking into this tax debate is also important to take into account. So although I, far from considering myself a representative of all citizens or communities, I would like to contribute with some humble reflections from my experience, I guess, with CSOs and grassroots organizations about what mining taxation could or could not in the future, especially as it regards, as Alexandra mentioned, to the energy transition opportunities. And I would like to share with you 3 ideas. And the first one is related to this idea of resource revenue always been at the center of the political arguments that justify the extraction of natural resources. So the idea that the exploitation of its natural resources conducts to development of a country has always been mediated by the idea that such an activity would generate the financial resources to boost the national and local economy. And of the such effects are also channels through employment, procurement, and other economic linkages. The main source of political legitimacy of for destruction of resources have been taxes and royalties. And in every debate I had the opportunity to observe in the last 10 years, I guess, around social and environmental conflicts, especially in Latin America, but not only, there was always someone from the industry, the government, or some members of the community claiming the importance of mining exactly because the revenues it generates for the state to be spent in social services or other. And yet, despite such revenues being so central from a political point of view and from a development point of view, there has been this clear trend that many of you have mentioned in the mining sector, especially since the last boom started at the end of the 90s, to erode such a base by asking and receiving fiscal incentive, including reducing the royalties payment, deducting assets more rapidly, or deducting royalties from taxation bills, but also engaging in profit shifting schemes, signing treaties for tax stability, and other. And just an example, in the case of Latin America, the Global Financial Integrity, together with Sede Trabajo, a Colombian NGO, found that in 2016, there was a gap of more than $10 billion between values reported by Colombia and those reported by all these trading partners in the mining sector. So they estimate around 2.8 billion revenue loss due to trade misinvoicing in that year. So this is an enormous challenge, I guess, for the mining sector now, but especially as it regards to the new boom that is commonly linked to the minerals that are critical for the energy transition. Because there are increased questions about the real contributions that mining is providing to the economy. Left aside all the questions, of course, about social and environmental impacts. And this is the case of Latin America, where mining, resistance against mining have been raising in the last years. And highly professionalized experts in civil society at the international and national level have also emerged, bringing this to light. So even if the new mineral boom is going to be contributed to the energy transition to fight climate change, developing countries, and especially developing countries' communities, won't accept that easily to become sort of the sacrifice sons of this transition, unless there is a clear engagement for social and environmental performance, but also unless there is a clear economic benefit for those countries and communities. Resistance against mining would continue to raise. And so the first idea I wanted to share is that rethinking mining taxation and defining new configurations that increase benefits for the countries and for communities is not only desirable, it is necessary for mining extraction to be viable. And yes, if fully maximized, these resources can be used to fund citizen needs, including sustainable development goals, bridge inequalities, reducing debt, etc. And so this brings me to my second idea, which is that I think that rethinking mining taxation will be necessary for extraction to happen, but won't be sufficient. I have mentioned the importance of social environmental performance, but I would like to focus here on another element, which is that we cannot continue to disassociate the definition of taxation regime and revenue collection from the use of revenue. I have often observed how in the middle of local social environmental conflicts with communities, mining companies or government officials tend to perceive their responsibility was only to pay their taxes, or national government perceive their responsibility is only to transfer the money to local governments. And so if nothing happens there, that's not of the problem. And this might be true in some sense in terms of legal responsibilities and jurisdiction, but if resource revenue is not having the impact desired, or that the impact we are assuming when we decide to extract natural resources, then the promise of the extraction of natural resources conducted to development is also broken. So the idea is that I think in designing mining taxation regimes, fiscal regimes, it is key to think about their expenditure. And there are particular configurations of fiscal regimes that can introduce huge distortions in the way revenues are spent. For example, when governments allow for a portion of taxes or royalties to be paid in kind or through public infrastructure, as it happens in Colombia or Peru, there are huge risks that decision-making around how to invest won't include the perspective and needs from all communities, but maybe just the groups that matter for the company that is investing directly those resources. But also there are interesting proposals in terms of how to use resource revenues to achieve sustainable development goals, to adapt and mitigate climate change, or even to help countries and communities to engage in their own energy transition and to diversify the economy, as the minister and the tax commissioner has also mentioned, and it's very important. And this is key to avoid the perverse cycle of dependency that has been the result of the last mining and oil booms. So the way fiscal regimes are designed can be aligned with this purpose. And it's key because it is key that we developing countries and research-rich countries will not only be contributed to the energy transition in developed countries or abroad, but also in their own countries. So in my view, innovative proposals in terms of revenue taxation should include these considerations as well. And my third and final idea is that this discussion is happening in a specific time, in the middle of the pandemic. And this implies that a lot of decisions are being made as of now with the idea of fostering the recovery. And those decisions can dramatically affect the structural and long-term fiscal regime if the risks that are out there materialize in terms of a race to the bottom, with governments reducing taxes to attract new projects or defining legal frameworks for critical minerals in a rush. This is a worrying trend, and I think this is what makes this discussion so present, so urgent. And this goes in hands with reducing socio-environmental standards, which is also happening as a result of, I guess, the pandemic and the need, the perceived need of fiscal incentive and reducing these standards to attract additional investment. So again, there is urgency in this debate, and the need for collaboration is more pressing, I guess, than ever to define minimum rates or at least some sort of general criteria for research-rich countries. Of course, this needs to be defined, taking into account the particularities of the sector. And as the IGF initiative has already claimed, there is a need for an active participation of research-rich countries themselves in these discussions about what is the minimum rate or the minimum standards for fiscal regimes and socio-environmental standards for the new mining boom. And such collaboration needs to be broad and includes fiscal terms, but as I said, also socio-environmental standards. Also taking into account the viability of new project is related to these dimensions. And I will finalize with a reflection that might seem like a contradiction to my first statement on the importance of revenue for mining to be politically viable. It is that resource revenue, it is the main political justification of mining as a source of development. And that's why it is key to maximize such rents. But as I also said, it is not enough. And we will need to be aware that communities' voice matters, which means that some projects will be viable and some others won't. But not, I think that the best we can do is including this voice in these discussions in an early stage. So these considerations can be taken into account also in these resource revenue discussions that we are engaging today. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ana Carolina, for your intervention. It is important that taxes is an important element of mining, but also the other element is the social and environmental. And I like what you say, that really communities matter and they will have a voice in determining what projects go on and which one will stop. Thank you very much for that. We're running out of time. We'll go over by 5 minutes. Yeah, I think that's possible. We can go over for 5 minutes. I only have one question for Anna and Ali. If you can quickly respond to that, and we can go to our closing remarks. So for Ali, there's one question from Robert on production sharing contracts and its viability in the mining sector. Given that, so do you see any merit in the argument that this would be burdensome for the investors as they have to put up the capital, and yet there's not so much resources to share as in the petroleum sector? Ali, if you can take that one briefly, that would be nice.
Thanks, Viola, and thank you, Robert, for your question. So I think it's a good point, but my response is that ultimately, when designing a fiscal regime, it's important that government sets the fiscal terms in a way to allow the investor to achieve its rate of return, so to recover the cost of the investment plus a return to capital. But there are lots of different ways to achieve that objective, and a regime that relies on corporate income tax and royalties might be one approach. Another might be production sharing, another might be service contracts, and we hope as part of the Future of Resource Taxation initiative to discover other ideas as well. So all of those fiscal regimes can be taken and can be designed and set in such a way so that the investor is able to achieve their required rate of return. It's just that some of those fiscal regimes might have be easier for government to administer and more reliable in terms of revenue collection, which is why perhaps they merit closer consideration in the mining sector. You're right that oil and gas is typically being more profitable than mining, in which case oil and gas companies are arguably able to absorb any regressive elements of production sharing regimes more easily than the mining sector. But I think, as I said, all of those issues can be worked out through careful and well thought out fiscal design, and we should explore all the different fiscal regimes that are available and the trade-offs between them as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali. There's one question for you, Anna. What's the impact of new technology? So we've mentioned briefly that technology, there's opportunities, and there's also likely that technology will replace labor in the mining sector. What do you think, what is the impact of technology in the mining sector in generating revenue? Anna, if you can respond on that briefly.
Yes, I think that's very important. And I think that somehow increase the relevance of the argument that resource revenue would be the center of the way in which destruction of natural resources would be justified. Because in other times, you would claim that some mining project would generate a lot of employment, especially in construction phases, etc. But it's also in production phases, at least. But as these new technologies developed, the portion of benefits, let's say, of benefits that are going to be generated by mining in relation to employment are going to be reduced. So how do you compensate for that? And again, this is a very important issue for local communities. So if you are not providing these incentive for communities to somehow adopt or receive mining projects in their territories, which is employment, you need to provide other type of incentive for communities. So what are the incentive? I mean, now that we talked about incentive for companies, what are the incentive for communities to receive mining projects in their territories? And I think that with new technologies in place, the role of resource revenue would be even bigger. But also, as I said, the use of such revenues, because this implies that you need to, unless different to what happened before, that you had the opportunity to generate a lot of economic linkages within local economies, you would need to use those revenues to actually provide support for those communities and for those local governments to diversify these local economies. So again, this brings us to the debate about how to use the government and how to define fiscal regimes in a way that the company can also be contributing to that deep diversification process that happens at the local level.
Thank you very much, Anna. There's one question which I'd like to ask before we close. Mr. Logan, if you can help respond to this question from Mr. Kientanga on the potential benefits of state participation as an alternative to relying on foreign investors. Mr. Logan, I think that's an important question, and I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. I did not see the question, so I have a bit of difficulty understanding.
Yeah, I can repeat that for you.
I heard your question. I'm
okay.
trying to understand whether the questioner wants to know whether it's better for the mines to be owned by the state than to rely on private investment. Is that the question?
Yes, I think so. So the potential of state participation as opposed to relying on foreign investors.
I don't know. You know, my limited view is that even China, who is a very centrally controlled state based on old socialist central command principles, runs its state-owned enterprises on absolute market principles, and that seems to be the only chance of its survival. The model of state-owned enterprises has failed in most developing countries, and has failed certainly in Africa, because the fundamentals of the transparency and the business model practices and the profit motive and the spend and the expenditure of all of that all gets conflated, and it's not very clear and lends itself to inefficiency, corruption, and other things. And so probably what we need is a hybrid model of a public-private partnership at the foundations of which is transparent contracts, and the ring fencing, like they attempted to do after they discovered oil in Ghana, like they attempted to do, they ring fenced the proceeds from Ghanaian oil to a publicly constituted body that determined that the proceeds of this will not be used for current expenditure, only for capital and others and others. And so there's two levels here. One is who should own it. The state in Africa and in many other developing countries, I can't speak for developed countries, have never really succeeded in running any form of company or industry on itself. It's normally riddled with inefficiencies and normally requires, you can look at the airlines, normally requires massive capital injections that comes from debt that the country must do. And so I don't think we have the necessary tools or the orientation to own this. However, the success lies in the measure of the partnership between the profit motive, which is driven by the private sector, and the ownership. And again, as I said in the beginning, is to the mineral. So my short answer is no, I don't think the state must necessarily be the only owner of the production process.
Thank you very much, Mr. Logan. Minister Magassouba already responded bits of the question, and it's on the chat. You can be able to see that. I'd like to thank our esteemed speakers for all their interventions and reflections. It is very clear that we need to rethink mining taxation, that for this to finance sustainable development, there is opportunity here driven by low carbon transition, which is going to increase the demand for minerals and metals. And so as government and non-government stakeholders, we need to come together to rethink how mining can benefit resource-rich countries. And briefly, I'm going to speak about the Future of Resource Taxation project, which this conversation is part of it. And in the Future of Resource Taxation project, which is a joint IGF and ATAF project, we are seeking to answer the two questions. So first is the dominant fiscal regime that has been mentioned in this conversation, the royalty and corporate income tax. Can it be improved from the design aspect, the implementation, and also the effectiveness for developing countries? And then the second question, are there alternative options that we can jointly look at for us to maximize mineral wealth from these countries? The initiative is an inclusive process and calls on all stakeholders, including government and non-government, as well as industry, to participate in ensuring that we are able to collect maximum revenues from the mining sector. In that end, at the start of the month, IGF and ATAF launched a call for ideas to non-governmental stakeholders for them to submit ideas on how we can improve revenue collection. A separate process will be rolled out for government next on how to participate to ensure that we maximize on revenue collection. The end result of this initiative is going to be a handbook of policy options for governments to consider and implement in order to maximize revenues from the sector and in order for these revenues to finance sustainable development. We have now come to the end of the webinar. Special thanks to our speakers for sharing their reflections on this topic. Thank you so much for the audience for your participation. Unfortunately, we could not take all the questions and answers. And also I'd like to thank our interpreters and all the technical support for this session. Thank you very much and have a good day.